Hope you all just had a drink, because I kind of needed a drink to get up onto the stage tonight. I'm feeling hecka nervous. It's real funny. I was hanging out with Auntie Mavis before we were doing a sound check, and we were like, have you got the wiri-wiris? I was like, yeah, I got the wiri-wiris. Why? That's because we care. So thank you for showing up tonight, and yeah, we care, and we know you care too. I guess tonight, jokes aside, I want to come with a bit of a sense of urgency. Oh, I've got the clicker. You know, I spend a lot of time with this pretty spunky young girl over here. She's 7.5, she comes up to here, she's the centre of my universe. And I also do a heck of a lot of work in climate change. Working with our marae on the ground, doing kind of assessments on how vulnerable we are. And so when I look at this little one here, and I'm thinking about the kind of inheritance that we're going to give to her and her mates, it's one of those things that Mavis was talking about before that kind of keeps you up at night, makes you sweat a little bit. I think that she referenced climate change there too. So I guess I just wanted to kind of put that down at the outset. I hadn't planned on starting like that, but that's where I'm at. One of the other things too about this little lady over there is that she's one of the generation, they run around, yelling out more tia tia, screaming out waiata. Who did it better, Mātai? No. And, you know, they're the first to chuck their hands up to try to scrap to be the kai karakia for kai, etc. Now, those ones will never ever know an ao without ao reo Māori. They are the hua of those movers and shakers that acted with absolute urgency when they saw that ao reo was on the brink of extinction, and they moved. In the 1980s, when we were at a crisis point, nobody was going to come and save ao reo. Nobody was going to come and offer billions of dollars to create a container so that, you know, these rebel rousers who were concerned about te reo Māori could do something fundamentally disruptive to our education system. But what our nannies and our koros of that time did was they acted off their absolute own backs when they saw that a crisis was sitting right in front of them, and they ran and they ran and they ran to ensure that the arero of our mukapuna would be etched with our reo. And right now, I feel that we're at a bit of a cliff face again. We're at a bit of a cliff face because when we start to look out at our taiao, she ain't going so well. I was the member of parliament, as Mātai was saying. He used to live down the road. We used to hang out a lot in Gizzy. But right at the time of Cyclone Gabriel, and that cyclone that came, and we all saw it, it just wrapped down the entire east coast. And you literally were seeing entire coastlines fall into the water. I remember being up in the air, and the whole entire, it looked like Papatuanuku had just been pulled and pulled apart. We saw Urupa slip right down. We had marae that were completely inundated, water. Some of those marae will never be able to be used again. Homes completely destroyed. Communities displaced, some for days, and we were just talking about that out the back too. Power gone, some for weeks, and in some instances, some for months. And that was just one severe weather event out of a back to back to back. Those of you that live in Tāmaki Makaurau, you would have just gone through the floods. That singular event, though, that cost Aotearoa $14 billion. And when you have that compound effect of event upon event upon event, they're supposed to be 1 in 100 year kind of events. You sort of got to start to ask yourself, is this kind of random? Or is there something that's going on underneath that? Well, it's not random. These severe weather events are a direct consequence of the Industrial Revolution that ensured that economies would pivot to be dependent on extraction, on colonisation, and on fossil fuels. Now we're coming to see the real hua of that trajectory that has formed the economic base of our nation for so long. We should be proud of how far we've come as Māori in terms of accruing wealth and asset. But when we start to look up at where our asset lies, so much still is sitting within sectors that have had a damaging impact on our taiao. Fun little fact is that Aotearoa, we think that we're pretty clean, green, etc. Well, we are one of the highest carbon emitters per capita in the OECD. And that's because our economy comes from two places, or rather our emissions come from two places. One is agriculture, and the other is transport. So you kind of get to this point, it's like, all right, that's all sad, bad, mad, and most of us probably know that things aren't going so great out there. You get to this point, it's like, all right, we've got to kind of stop talking about it, and we've got to do things fundamentally different. We've got to have the courage that our nannies and our koros, when they saw that there was that imminent crisis of our language about to be lost, we have to have that same kind of courage to do things fundamentally different and pivot. So one of the things that I look to for inspiration from that reanga who went out there and, I guess, kick-started again our entire language revolution, is that when they took our babies out of an education system that sought to erase us, they didn't go again and just build a school that was based on those same kind of mamai principles. What they did was absolutely deconstruct the house, and they started again from the bottom up. It was a grassroots-led movement, and they created something fundamentally different based on whakapapa, not whiteboards. I think that that's where we're kind of at the moment, is that our economic base can't sustain a kind of aisle that we need to be passing on to our tamariki. Every single report, if you can be bothered reading most of them, will talk about how we've got such a short runway in terms of the time we've got left to fix our taiao. I often think about this too, is that, who are we as mana whenua if we don't have whenua? So, she ain't all doom and gloom. I think that we're in a pretty good spot right now, because I think that this is the creative time that we can start to reimagine. What does it look like for our Māori economy to be sovereign? What does it look like if we're basing those sovereign decisions on mukupuna, making good mukupuna decisions? When I start to reimagine a different kind of world that has a fundamentally pivoted asset base, I start to think about whenua Māori. We might have huge, big, renewable assets on our whenua, where our people aren't just passive lessees. We're in the box seat, we own the asset, we own the power that's been generated, both for economic liberation, but also power sovereignty and power resilience. I think about papakainga, micro-scale grids in our kainga, our whole entire hapori being powered up, power resilience, power sovereignty. I think about our young ones who are far more tech-savvy than me, and I can barely operate a computer, but whole new industries based around a green economy where green tech, massive globally, and we're still at the formative stages right here. What if we were leading out in terms of indigenous carbon markets, indigenous biodiversity markets? We were incentivizing our people to look after the whenua and not pollute it. And in order to achieve a vision, you kind of need a few steps to get there. And I'm looking at this at the moment as a young person, once upon a time. About 20 odd years ago, I had these kind of dreadlocks flying, and I was living up not far from here in a little place called Flagstaff, Arizona. And I was working with a whole heap of natives on a campaign to stop oil extraction and the use of water to storage. They're using millions and millions of gallons, as they call them over there, of water to slurry coal out to power big cities like Nevada. And they were drilling up in a wāhi called Black Mesa. And we were going hard with this campaign to sort of stop what was happening there. But one of the things I noticed, and again, this was 20 years ago, is that there were whole hapori that were pivoting to this thing called renewable energy. They were setting up all these little micro-scale solar grids, which I'd never heard of before. And now in the United States, there's over 80 federal tribes that have utility-scale size renewable energy plants on their land. These things are worth millions and millions and millions of dollars just to construct, let alone the revenue that comes in on top of. So in order to get to a place like that, I think there's been a bit of a hesitancy. We're still, grappling over the feasibility studies and trying to do those types of things. But we have the opportunity to act, and we have the opportunity to act now. But what we do need is a really clear strategy of how to get us there. We need investment, long-term vision, not short-term gains. We need ownership of the asset, not just, as I said before, be a passive lessee. We need to collectivise our asset base, and yes, we do it in parts, but it's worth $126 billion, and there's so much more that we could do if we did it together. I think now is one of the most exciting times to be alive, because there are so many different opportunities ahead of us if we are brave enough to make the decisions to change. I started with my daughter up there. Her name is Hiwa Iterangi. And Hiwa Iterangi, she's the 9th star of the Matariki constellation, the one that you cast forth your dreams and aspirations for the crops of the year ahead. And when I cast forth my dreams and aspirations for the year ahead, it is one based on hope, because I'm hopeful that our economic leaders will pivot to a different foundation, a different economic foundation, and make mukapuna decisions today that will take us away from the extractive industries that have been harmful to our taiao, so that we can actually hand on an asset that is papa tuanuku to our kids. Hioi, thank you for coming out tonight. Kia ora tātou.
Ko te reo